Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to day 2 of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, as we go through this lesson, be sure you are taking your own notes or you're using the worksheet that I uploaded to Canvas to take notes on, because there will be a little quiz on this material at the end. Now, again, no big assessment on the Civil Rights Movement, but we are going to have a series of little quizzes, and this is the final set of new material for the year. Okay. Now, where we came from in lesson 1, we reviewed segregation. Segregation refers to separation. Segregation was put in place by Jim Crow laws. It was upheld by the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Then that gets challenged in Brown versus the Board of Education by the NAACP. You had national lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and state lawyers like Oliver Hill challenging separate but equal in terms of education. Brown versus the Board of Education is going to say schools must desegregate because separate schools are inherently unequal. That's going to lead to a variety of responses. Some people are going to integrate very quickly, some people are not. All right. And then we can use that ruling to begin to desegregate other things like bus lines. And we talked about the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. And the two big figures there are going to be Rosa Parks and Dr. King. Okay. Well, their bus boycott is successful. All right. And we do begin to see changes in Montgomery. But there is still a ways to go, which is where we're going to pick up today at the beginning of lesson 2. Now we're going to fast forward to 1961. Okay, so the Montgomery bus boycott was in the 50s. We're going to jump to 1961 to something called the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders, okay, were a group of African American and white people that were protesting segregation on public bus routes throughout the South. Okay, they're going to start in D.C., go down through Virginia into North Carolina, then South Carolina, Georgia, and then Alabama, and eventually arrive in Mississippi on May the 24th. So they're going to start May the 4th and arrive May the 24th. Now notice, the further south they get, okay, the more violence erupts. All right, these people that are simply protesting peacefully and demanding an end to segregation on bus routes are going to be attacked violently by mobs. Okay. Originally, I think it was a group of 13 men. Okay. The May 14th attacks are probably the worst. All right. Supposedly, there was a bomb on the bus. There was a smoke bomb that was thrown on the bus that causes everybody to get out. And when people get out, there are protesters outside ready to attack them. Okay. But again, based on the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr., based on the ideas of Gandhi, these protesters that are getting attacked are not going to react violently, okay? And that's going to bring a lot of attention to their cause. Now, one of the worst cities in the South in terms of segregation and discrimination, one of the worst cities in the South was Birmingham. So a lot of civil rights protesters are going to head to Birmingham to try to make it an example, okay? The protesters in Birmingham call for an okay, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to lead the demonstration in Birmingham, okay? He will be arrested. In response to him being arrested, okay, his followers will continue, or his supporters will continue the protests, okay, and turn it into an economic protest, which means we're not going to patronize any stores, we're going to stand outside and protest the stores, but we're not going to go in. Okay. And real quickly, I want to go back to this picture right here. I want to show you, notice who they are getting involved now. Children. Okay. Children are going to be involved in this as well. Now, the reason I say that, okay, is because the response to these peaceful protesters who aren't doing anything about except saying we want equal rights, the response to these peaceful protesters is phenomenal. Okay. You can see here we've got guard dogs that have been called out, okay, that are attacking people. In fact, his pants are getting ripped here. You've got these fire hoses. Now, these fire hoses had so much pressure in them they could rip the bark off a tree, and they're being turned on protesters. So there are news crews filming this. Okay, you got these vicious dogs. You got these high-powered hoses right here, and keep in mind that image that I showed you just a second ago of the kids. Okay, so you can imagine: are we turning the dogs on the kids? Are we turning the hoses on the kids? Okay, this negative media attention is going to force Birmingham to end segregation. Okay? It draws the world's attention to the racial segregation in Birmingham and the racial segregation in the South. And it's going to pave the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay? So the protests in Birmingham turn out to be very, very important to the continued efforts to desegregate society in America. Our next big event is going to come in August 1963, and that's the March on Washington. Now, Kennedy had a civil rights bill. It had been sent to Congress, and I think it had been sent back to him, and he was sitting on it. He hadn't acted on it yet. Okay. Now, this is August of 63. Keep in mind, he's going to be assassinated in November. So nobody's quite sure what Kennedy is going to do in terms of civil rights. He hasn't made a move yet. The NAACP and the NCLC, okay, and this SCLC are going to organize this march on August the 28th, 1963. And between 200 and 250,000 protesters show up. And it's everybody there. There are celebrities there, there are entertainers there, sports personalities, black people, white people, men, women, children. Okay, everybody's there. In fact, Kennedy had called in the Park Police, National Guard, Washington, D.C. Metro Police, and stuff like that. And he's like, look, if there's any chance of something going wrong here, I want you to shut down this protest. Okay. Bob Dylan was there, Joan Baez. There were famous entertainers. They were going to perform and have music there as well. And there were a series of speeches throughout the day. Now, this last speech, okay, that is given is by Dr. King. And of course, that speech is the famous I Have a Dream speech. Okay, I have a dream today that one day little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys, little white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged by the color of their skin, where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Okay, very, very powerful speech, very, very famous speech. Now, what's interesting is Dr. King had used this I Have a Dream motif before in some of his speeches. In fact, some of his advisors were like, the night before, they're like, look, you got to change up the speech. Okay, this is going to be a major deal. We want it to be powerful and stuff like that. He didn't make any changes to it. He kept with the I Have a Dream motif, and it is a very, very powerful speech, especially when he starts appealing about children coming together. Okay, if you have children, if you're a parent, that is very, very powerful. This speech is going to influence public opinion to support the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So between the success in Birmingham and then the success of this March on Washington, that's going to lead us to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Right? Now, the Civil Rights Act. Oh, and before we go, the March on Washington also demonstrates the power of nonviolent mass protests. We've kind of seen that already with the sit-ins and the bus boycotts and stuff like that. But like I said, Kennedy called out all these police officers to shut down the march if something began to happen, and nothing happened. You had 250,000 people there, and everybody was peaceful. Okay? So once again, it shows the power of nonviolent resistance, okay, and nonviolent mass protests. Now, back to the Civil Rights Act 1964. Civil Rights Act 1964 is signed by President Johnson. Now, supposedly, it had first been advocated by Kennedy in 1963, but Kennedy hadn't acted on it, and Kennedy gets assassinated, so who knows what would have happened. But Johnson does. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically sums up what we've been fighting for, okay? It's going to say we cannot discriminate based on race, religion, and gender. Okay? We cannot discriminate based on race, religion, and gender. And as a result, okay, since we cannot discriminate based on race, religion, and gender, as a result, public accommodations have to be desegregated. Okay? They have to be desegregated. So basically, we're taking Brown versus the Board of Education and we are applying it to all areas of segregation. Everything has to desegregate because we cannot discriminate based on race, religion, or gender. Now, even though the law is there, having the law there and enforcing it are two totally different issues. So, what we're going to see is something called the Freedom Summer. Okay, as things begin to desegregate, white college students, African American college students are going to head down to the South and try to help with the desegregation process. And one of the big areas they're going to focus on is getting African Americans registered to vote. All right. Now, like I said, you're going to have people from all different backgrounds. You're going to have white students there, and you're going to have African American students there. It is very, very dangerous for these, especially for these white students. Okay, some volunteers are beaten, some are murdered. In fact, there were three young men that were murdered in Mississippi. Okay, and their bodies were buried in a car, and the car was basically dumped in a big mud pit. Okay, so it is very, very dangerous. There's constant harassment. There's constant intimidation. The KKK is involved. Okay, in the end, it really doesn't get a lot of people registered to vote, but the attention that is drawn to the issue is going to lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, so it does bring massive attention to this part of the civil rights movement. And like I said, it's going to lead us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Once again, it's signed by President Johnson. The Voting Rights Act, okay, got rid of all those restrictions. Remember, we talked about literacy tests, we talked about property owning requirements. There were a bunch of tests that were out there before African Americans could get the right to vote. They had to pass all these tests, okay? All right. This is going to enforce the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment already said we can't discriminate against people voting. We're going to eliminate those literacy tests. We're going to get rid of those property owning requirements. Okay. We also have to have bilingual ballots for minorities. All right. And now, as much as we appreciate the college kids coming down to register people to vote, now we're going to get the federal government involved and federal officials are going to be sent in. All right. And as a result, we're going to see many, many more people register to vote in the South. Okay. So things are really moving now in terms of desegregation civil rights movement. Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is getting the federal government involved, and the federal government is going to work to end desegregation or to end segregation in public places. Okay, now we have the power of the federal government working to end segregation in public places. Now, don't forget, you got a little quiz on this, okay? Review your notes, review that worksheet, take the little quiz, and then we got one more lesson this week, and we'll wrap up the civil rights movement.